Alright, so to proceed with the actual computation of the variances, first we tackle on direct materials, direct labor, and variable factory overhead. So in the computation of the variances, I'd like to graphically present the variances in some sort of a diagram wherein we would be able to visualize where the differences are, where we could combine them, and what actually are the amounts or the independent variables which are changing, which would lead to the variances, right? So for the first group of variances, we can plot here in the left side actual cost, which is computed as actual price or rate multiplied by actual quantity. And then on the right side, we can have standard cost, which is the standard price or the standard rate multiplied by the standard quantity. Okay, so when we say standard quantity, this is the standard quantity of input allowed for actual production. Okay, so just remember that. So right here, we could actually already compute for the total variance of what we are analyzing. So for example, total direct material variance, we'll already have it by computing for the difference between standard and actual, as well as direct labor and factory overhead. However, if we'd like to break this variance down into its components, which is actually two, we can insert here a figure in the middle, which multiplies actual quantity by the standard price or rate. Okay, and then if we try to get the difference between the actual cost and this middle figure, we would arrive at the spending or the price or rate variance. Okay, now why is that the case? So it's very important to note here what actually are the independent variables which are moving or are changing, so as to determine what is the cause of the difference. Okay, so when we go from left to right, actual cost less this middle figure here, we can notice here that the actual quantity did not change, whereas the price was the factor or the variable which changed, right? So it's more or less can be also expressed as actual quantity multiplied by the difference in standard and actual price. So in that sense, we would be arriving at the spending or the price or rate variance, since we are looking at the change in the price, right? And then moving on, if we would also be trying to get the difference between the middle figure and the standard costs, again, if we are to look at the variables here, we can see that the standard price or rate did not change, whereas the actual and standard quantity are the variables that change. This leads us to the usage quantity, or as known as efficiency variance in the process, right? So again, this could also be expressed through analyzing the variables affected. For this instance, we can have standard price or rate multiplied by the change in the quantity, or the difference between actual quantity and standard quantity. All right. And then lastly, if we get the sum of the two variances, we arrive at the total variance here. Or in the first step, the much straightforward approach would actually be just to compute for the difference between standard and actual cost. Okay. So just to provide an example here, for example, we have actual price or actual rate of 10 pesos and then actual quantity of 10 units. We arrive at a total actual cost of 100 pesos. And then next here, if we have a standard price of 12 pesos, we arrive at standard price at actual quantities of 10 at 120. Okay. So right here, we could already see that the spending variance is 20 pesos, right? Favorable, right? So we have a favorable variance because we have actual cost less than the standard price at actual quantity of 120. Or another approach is to get the difference in price multiplied by the actual quantity. So 12, the difference between 12 and 10 is 2 multiplied by 10 units is the actual quantity. We'd arrive at the same variance, which is 20 pesos favorable. Okay. And then moving on, if we have a standard quantity allowed for actual production of 5 units, we retain the 12 pesos as the standard price or rate. We arrive at 60, okay, 60 pesos as the total standard cost. So again, if we try to get the difference between these first two items here, we get 20 pesos favorable variance, spending variance. Then if we get the difference between 120 and 60, we get 60 pesos unfavorable variance, right? And then if we get the total variance, we arrive at 40 pesos unfavorable variance. Okay, so at this point, I'd also like to point out that in our problems that we encounter, we can have two offsetting variances, wherein one is unfavorable and the other is favorable, which leads to a netting, effect at the total variance level, right? Alright, so just a few notes with regard to direct material, direct labor, and variable factory overhead. If the problem is silent, we can assume that the actual quantity purchased would be equal to the actual quantity used. So this is just an assumption if the problem is silent and it requires you to make use of the actual quantity used. Okay. However, if of course the problem explicitly states that the actual quantity purchased is different from the actual quantity used, then we should be making use of the most relevant figure. Like for example, if we would be computing for the actual cost, we should use for the actual quantity used given in the problem. And the next here is that overhead time is equal to labor time. For variable factory overhead, usually the application base which is being used is the labor time as well, right? So this is an assumption applicable to most of the problems. However, of course, if the problem provides for a different overhead time versus a labor time, then we should be making use of the more relevant figure. For example, if the problem asks for direct labor variances, we should use for the direct labor time. But if the problem is focused on variable factory overhead, then we should use for the given overhead time, right? Alright, so just to have a sample problem here for direct materials, just to provide a basic, example for what we have just discussed. Right, so the given here, during July, company A's direct material costs for the production of product X were as follows, right? So we have standard unit price of 12.5, standard quantity allowed for actual production of 6.3 thousand units, actual unit purchase price of 13 pesos, quantity purchased for and used for actual production 6,900 units. Required total material cost variance, material spending variance or price variance, materials efficiency or usage variance. Okay, so basically, it requires us to analyze the direct material variances into its various components. Okay. Right. So we can proceed to analyze this just as how we explained the variances earlier. So first, we can plot here the actual cost, which is computed as actual price multiplied by the actual quantity. Okay. And we do have an actual price of 13 and then actual quantity of 6.9. Okay. So actual price of 13 and then actual quantity of 6.9. Okay. And then next we proceed to get the standard price multiplied by the actual quantity. Okay. So the actual quantity stays the same, but we change the standard price. So the standard price is 12.5 as given in the problem. Okay. And then lastly, we compute for the total standard cost, which is standard price multiplied by the standard quantity, which is also, I think, given. So 12.5 multiplied by 6.3 gives us 78,750. Alright. So total costs here have already been computed for purposes of our analysis. Okay. So let's just go back here. The total standard quantity allowed for actual production is 6.3. Okay. So that is what we try to plot here. And then to proceed, we can deduct the first two items here to arrive at the spending variance of 3,450 unfavorable. Okay, unfavorable because 89,700 is greater than 86,250, which leads to overspending on the part of the company because the actuals are less than the standard at actuals, right? And then if we get the difference between this middle figure and the total standard cost, we get the usage or quantity variance of 7,500. Same, unfavorable, because the standard price at actual quantities is greater. The 86,250 is greater than the total standard cost of 78,750, right? And then if we combine these two variances together, we get 10,950 unfavorable, right? So both unfavorable leads to a greater unfavorable variance overall. Or another approach here is to get the difference between the actual and standard to arrive at the total variance. 89,700 less 78,750 give you the same total variance amount, right? Alright, so for this slide, we are just presenting an alternative presentation for our solution. Again, as mentioned earlier, we might as well get difference in the price for the material spending variance or the price variance. Get the difference in the price, multiply by the actual quantity. It would give us the same variance here, 3,450. And then for the materials efficiency or usage variance, we could also might as well get the difference in the quantity multiplied by the standard price, right? So 600 units multiplied by 12.5, 750, 7,500 unfavorable. So just to get the 600 units difference in quantity here, this is actually the difference between 6.9 and 6.3, right? Which is 600 units. And then lastly, total materials cost variance would still be the sum of the spending variance and the efficiency variance. 10,950 unfavorable.